China issues new sanctions for U.S. officials and members of Canada's parliament. To boycott or not to boycott? It's a dilemma some Chinese sports associations are facing over footwear brand Nike. Hundreds of million-dollar contracts linked them to the American brand. Fashion brand Hugo Boss is dealing with trouble over cotton from Xinjiang. Its back-and-forth attitude has some calling the company two-faced. Will the U.S. punish Communist China over its lack of pandemic transparency? The U.S. Secretary of State appears hesitant to give details. And how do Chinese Communist leaders approach the U.S. and what are their plans to defeat it? A bombshell speech tells all. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. China has sanctioned U.S. officials and members of Canada's parliament. It's a retaliation for sanctions the U.S. and its allies imposed on China for human rights abuses. Here are the details.
The Chinese regime has sanctioned Gail Manchin, the chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. The CCP also sanctioned Canadian Member of Parliament Michael Chong. He's the Conservative Party's foreign affairs critic. Michael Chong tweeted, "We've got a duty to call out China for its crackdown in Hong Kong and its genocide of Uyghurs. If that means China sanctions me, I'll wear it as a badge of honor." China sanctioned these individuals after the U.S. sanctioned Chinese officials, a construction company, and a police force in Xinjiang. That's because they are allegedly involved in the genocide of Uyghur Muslims. Chinese officials say these accusations are based on rumors and disinformation. The people who have been sanctioned are prohibited from going to China or Hong Kong, and Chinese institutions can't do business with them. China also sanctioned Tony Perkins, who's the vice chair of the Religious Freedom Commission. Canada's Parliamentary Subcommittee on International Human Rights got hit with sanctions by China too. In February, Canadian members of Parliament voted unanimously to classify the Chinese regime's persecution of Uyghurs as genocide. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, along with his cabinet, didn't vote. Aaron O'Toole is the leader of the Conservative Party in Canada. He tweeted that these parliament members who the CCP sanctioned have used the freedom they have as Canadians to call attention to the genocide against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. He says he's proud of the effort both parties put in. China has detained over 1 million Uyghurs as well as other Muslim minorities and forced many of them to work against their will. That's according to the Department of Labor. O'Toole also said Chong is a living example of how Canadians with Chinese ancestry can stand up to the CCP's repression while still being proud of their rich Chinese history and culture.
Gail Manchin says she is flattered by the sanctions. She says it means Beijing recognizes her stance and that she'll continue her work to call out genocide and violations of religious freedom. To boycott or not to boycott? This is a dilemma some Chinese sports associations are facing with regard to Nike. The American sports brand is one of the companies that said no to cotton from China's Xinjiang region. It cited concerns over forced labor. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, then urged people to boycott those foreign brands. Many brands, including Nike, are impacted. But two major Chinese sports giants, the Chinese Basketball Association and the Chinese Soccer Association, remain quiet. This despite strong calls for them to terminate their contracts with Nike. Football News posted on Chinese social media Weibo over the weekend that the Chinese Soccer Association condemned Nike's rejection of Xinjiang cotton as a wrong move. But the post was quietly deleted shortly after. Nike has been the largest sponsor of China's national teams for a long time. It has a contract with China's national soccer team worth over $400 million and another $100 million contract with a major soccer association. China's national basketball team players also wear Nike jerseys. Besides, Nike helps China communicate with the NBA so that the NBA can help train Chinese players. Chinese media Sina Sports comments that sports associations are in a dilemma. They might not have the legal basis to terminate the contracts. But when Chinese players wear Nike products during the games, some Chinese people will criticize them. And the biggest problem is Chinese sports authorities have not issued any guideline as to how to deal with Nike yet. Hugo Boss is another brand that faces boycotts in China over the issue of Xinjiang cotton. 3 Chinese celebrities publicly cut ties with the German fashion brand over the weekend, and Chinese internet users slammed it as two-faced. Hugo Boss said last Thursday on Chinese social media Weibo that it would continue to purchase and support Xinjiang cotton. But a day later, it said the post was unauthorized and has now been deleted. It posted last Friday saying the company does not tolerate forced labor and urges its global suppliers to follow suit. It says the company has not procured any goods originating in the Xinjiang region from direct suppliers. On Saturday, it posted again on its Weibo saying it cherishes all long-standing relationships with partners in China. Chinese internet users accuse Hugo Boss for changing its position, saying the brand was being two-faced. The Europe-based association Better Cotton Initiative stopped certifying cotton products from Xinjiang last year. It cited forced labor there as the reason. That means these cotton products are put on a de facto blacklist in international trade. CCP mouthpiece CCTV reported lately that some cotton exporting companies in Xinjiang have lost more than $10 million since last year. China is the second largest cotton exporter in the world. More than half of all Chinese textile products are exported to other countries. The loss is not limited to exports. It's not clear yet if supply chains in the textile industry will leave China altogether. The Chinese capital of Beijing woke up on Sunday morning surrounded in thick dust, carrying extremely high levels of hazardous particles. That's as a second sandstorm in 2 weeks hit the city due to winds from drought-hit Mongolia and northwestern China. Visibility in the city was reduced, with the tops of some skyscrapers obscured by the sandstorm. Pedestrians were even forced to cover their eyes as gusts of dust swept through the streets. Beijing's official air quality index reached a maximum level of 500 on Sunday morning, with floating particles known as PM10 surpassing 2,000 micrograms per cubic meter in some districts. Readings of smaller PM2.5 particles were above 300 micrograms per cubic meter, far higher than China's standard of 35 micrograms. PM2.5 particles are especially harmful because they are very tiny and can enter the bloodstream, while PM10 is a larger particle that can enter the lungs. The China Meteorological Administration said the city might face more sandstorms in April due to the unfavorable weather this year. A former U.S. CDC director says it is possible the CCP virus leaked from a lab in China, and a former State Department virus investigator agrees with him. NTD's Don Ma has more on that.
The former director of U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, says it's possible the CCP virus leaked from a lab.
My own view, it's an only opinion. I'm allowed to have opinions now. I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory, escaped. Other people don't believe.
Dr. Robert Redfield's interview took place in January, but was aired in full on Sunday. The Wuhan lab leak theory came most notably from an evidential fact sheet by the Trump administration. It alleges that the Chinese military ordered scientists to experiment with viruses that were 96% genetically similar to the current virus, and accidental infections from the virus experiments led to the outbreak. The U.S. State Department's former lead virus investigator seems to agree with Redfield's view and the fact sheet. David Asher told UK outlet The Mail on Sunday that a lab leak is not 100% certain, but it seems at this stage the only logical source of origin. He says that 3 scientists are believed to have become sick with COVID-like symptoms in the Wuhan lab. Redfield also says the virus may have already started spreading in September and October 2019. That's before China's first official reported case. A recent study by the American Association for the Advancement of Science also partly affirms Redfield's timeframe. Its results put the spread starting between mid-October to November 2019. The current CDC director says she is neither for nor against the natural origin theory or the lab leak theory. Don Ma, NTD News.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is suggesting that the Biden administration probably will not hold the CCP accountable for its handling of the pandemic. During a CNN interview on Sunday, Blinken was hesitant to say whether the U.S. will punish the Chinese regime over its lack of transparency in the early stages of the outbreak. His answer seemingly acknowledged the regime's role in the outbreak, but said the U.S. will look to the future rather than the past.
The damage that is being done around the world because of this pandemic. No repercussions? No punishment?
But we do need to have both accountability for the past, but I think our focus needs to be on building a stronger system for the future.
Blinken's stance marks a departure from his predecessor. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo openly stated that the Chinese regime must be held accountable for its role in the pandemic. Pompeo tweeted last September that the U.S. must hold the CCP responsible for the virus that is now destroying hundreds of thousands of lives all across the world. A suicide bomber in South China killed at least 7 people. An insider told us the bomber wanted to revenge a local official that allegedly took away compensation money from villagers. NTD's Chang Chun has more.
A deadly bomb attack occurred in Mingjing village in South China's Guangdong province last week. Among the killed was a local Communist Party secretary. According to local police, 59-year-old veteran Mr. Hu took explosives to the village office building. 5 people, including Hu, died on the spot, and another 5 people were injured. But a villager told NTD at least 7 people died. The police didn't explain the cause of the bombing. The villager said Hu was a veteran and was protesting against corrupt officials. Authorities confiscated about 10 acres of land from villagers last year. That's in order to build a more profitable project. Hu's house was also forcibly demolished, but the village head allegedly took away all the villagers' compensation money. And after protests failed, Hu carried a bomb on his back and rushed into the village's Communist Party committee meeting. The bomb killed the vice village head and the village's Communist Party secretary. The village head was severely injured.
This is just a criminal act. It is not a terrorist attack. It is because the compensation was not legally distributed, and it aroused his anger, so he took revenge.
Canada-based Chinese writer Sheng Xue believes the CCP's development strategy has to do with it.
We all know the CCP's entire development strategy for a very long time has been to make the state rich and the people poor. The CCP doesn't have the ability to improve the productivity of the society as a whole. Its plunder of the people is getting more and more serious.
Sheng Xue says the vast majority of the people can only hold back their anger and say nothing, but some are rising up.
The violent methods the CCP officials use are getting more and more widespread, more unscrupulous. When it crosses the limit, it will definitely encounter some resistance. People will feel that violence in Chinese society is rampant.
Sheng says the veteran chose to seek justice through violence. But first of all, this crime was caused by party authorities. If the CCP chooses not to reflect on it, such tragedies will definitely increase. Chang Chun, NTD News.
Chinese telecom giant Huawei is striving to find a breakthrough and less glamorous alternatives such as fish farming and mining. U.S. sanctions are believed to have driven this move. Months after the Trump administration dealt a heavy blow to Huawei, the company's mobile phone shipments plummeted by more than 40% in the fourth quarter of 2020. The company is now turning to new customers. According to Bloomberg, among them is a fish farm in eastern China. It is roofed with tens of thousands of solar panels and outfitted with Huawei inverters. Another new customer is a mine in China's coal-rich Shanxi province. Huawei is reportedly providing Wi-Fi sensors and cameras deep beneath the earth in mine pits. Huawei is now banking on growing those sales, as well as its cloud services and data analytics solutions. It depends on them to sustain the business. Huawei's founder and CEO said at the opening of a mining innovation lab in February that right now we keep looking for new opportunities to survive. A 25-year agreement between Communist China and Iran. The two regimes are seeking to bolster their alliance. Beijing agrees to safeguard the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, and Tehran urges the U.S. to remove sanctions. NTD's Wen Hui has more.
Tehran and Beijing signed an agreement to further strengthen their economic and political alliance. This 25-year agreement brings Iran into the Chinese regime's Belt and Road Initiative. That's a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure scheme led by the CCP. Both regimes are sanctioned by the U.S., the Chinese regime for its human rights abuses, and the Iranian regime for its nuclear development. The Chinese foreign minister said before the signing ceremony, "Our relations with Iran will not be affected by the current situation, but will be permanent and strategic." The Iranian Commerce Ministry said days before that Beijing will also safeguard the 2015 Iran nuclear deal and the interests of their alliance. The Trump administration left the nuclear deal in 2018 and resumed sanctions on Iran. Trump said the U.S. has definitive proof that the Iran nuclear deal was a lie and that the regime has been pursuing nuclear weapons. President Biden, on the other hand, has sought to revive talks with Iran. But Tehran wants the current U.S. administration to remove sanctions first in order to resume any negotiations. Beijing praised Biden for his willingness to restart talks, saying, under the new administration, the Americans want to reconsider their policy and return to the nuclear accord, and China welcomes their move. Wen Hui, NTD News.
In the middle of escalating tensions between China and the U.S., a speech from 5 years ago is going viral. In it, a Chinese Communist Party insider reveals how the regime plans to get the U.S. out of its way so that communism spreads around the world. The plan is detailed and ranges from manipulating U.S. elections to propping up enemies in America's backyard to deep infiltration, all the while in a quiet and covert manner. The bombshell speech is now making a splash online. So far, the original video hasn't been found, but the transcript is circulating widely on the internet. The original speech was given by a famous expert in China named Jing. He's known for his expertise on American issues. He also enjoys a high position at one of China's top universities. Multiple China experts say Jing's speech is credible, as his main points line up with the Chinese regime's actions over the past few decades. His comments are particularly valuable because they provide a rare glimpse into the mindset of communist leaders, what they think of the U.S. and their planned moves against it. Jing says the CCP has a 100-year plan, that is, to become the world's leader before 2049. But the United States stands as the biggest obstacle to that goal. Jing says Communist Party head Xi Jinping aims to make sure the regime can become as powerful as the U.S. in this generation, so that by next generation it can surpass and take charge of the United States. Jing compares the U.S. to the most valued employee in a workplace, handsome, capable, and in their prime. In that scenario, the Chinese regime had just been promoted to the number 2 position. Jing says the regime wants to squeeze out the U.S. in order to reach the top, but doesn't dare to start a war. So what's there to do? It has come up with other strategies. Jing says one of the main tactics is to become intertwined with the U.S. economy. That means pumping Chinese investment into the U.S. and controlling its market. He says the more intertwined they become, the harder it is for the U.S. to fight back. But for Beijing, Chinese investment in the U.S. also serves another major purpose, influencing the country's political system. Jing says the Chinese regime strives to make sure every congressional district in the U.S. has Chinese investment backing. That way, the regime can directly influence politicians through gaining control over thousands of votes. He added that actually the House of Representatives can be controlled, and explained some simple math to illustrate his point. The U.S. is home to over 300 million people. In the House, the number of representatives is capped at 435. On average, every congressional district represents about 750,000 people, but only around 30% will vote in elections. So effectively, a little over 200,000 votes decides candidates' fates. Jing says House races are usually quite close. He estimates the gap between each candidate is less than 10,000. In that case, he says if you have thousands of votes on your hands, you are the candidate's dad, meaning to say anyone who controls that number of votes controls the candidates and the election result. He went on to say that if China does a good job, it can buy the United States and turn the U.S. Congress into the Second People's Congress of China. The National People's Congress is China's top legislature. Jing noted that the regime also has other tricks up its sleeve, aside from manipulating elections, like fostering enemies in America's backyard. He says if the U.S. has 4 major enemies, it would struggle and lose its direction, and that the Chinese regime's strategy is to make sure that the U.S. has plenty of enemies to keep it occupied. He explained the terrorists are currently one. Russia is very similar to one. But it's not enough. China once wanted to prop up Brazil, but points out that Brazil has the potential but isn't fully up to the task either. That's it for Beijing's plans to subvert the U.S. from within. But Jing says the CCP doesn't stop there, that it has even more ideas to weaken America's power from the outside. For this strategy, the main focus is on the Indo-Pacific region. To understand how the Chinese regime's external tactics work, we have to first understand the importance of the Indo-Pacific region. Spanning from America's west coast to western India, the Indo-Pacific is critical to the well-being of the globe. It is home to more than half of the world's population and is responsible for over 60% of global GDP. The world's three biggest economies are also involved here: the US, China, and Japan. These countries can thrive because the current global order keeps the region free and open. Critical trade routes are secure, so countries can freely move their energy and goods. The U.S. serves as a police force and guards that order. America's position as the global leader manifests in that power. Only the U.S. can project its strength into almost any region of the world. And in the case of the Indo-Pacific, the U.S. can't do that largely because of robust alliances and a powerful military. These are Beijing's two targets. For the Chinese Communist regime, the South China Sea is a good starting point. This strategic region sits between China, Vietnam, Taiwan, and the Philippines. Beijing's plan is to build and expand artificial islands there, which are turned into military bases. The expanded reach gives China's military more access, designed to help them gradually take control of the area. The South China Sea is shaped like an inverted pyramid, with the Paracel Islands in the west, the Spratlys in the south, and the Scarborough Shoal in the east. Jing's original speech is from 2016, and at the time he said the regime had already taken control of the west and south. China hasn't militarized the Scarborough Shoal in the east, but had already seized the area in 2012. Jing explained that once China completes its control of the east, the South China Sea would become part of the regime's territory. Control in that area would give China the ability to choke out one of the world's most important energy and trade routes at any time. Almost a third of the world's crude oil goes through the South China Sea every year. A third of global shipping also travels through the region. Jing says this could put America's alliance with Asia in danger. That's because trade routes in the South China Sea are the lifeblood for two key U.S. allies, Japan and South Korea. Both countries receive almost 90% of their imported oil through the South China Sea, and 70% of Japan's external trade is also shipped through the area. Jing says if China chokes the lifeline of these two allies, they would probably start doubting the value of forming an alliance with America. For Beijing, gaining control of the South China Sea gives it the ability to kill two birds with one stone. Aside from the alliance, a bigger target is the U.S. military. The U.S. military can project power in the Indian Ocean largely because it maintains a pivot point there. It's a military base called Diego Garcia. It sits near the center of the Indian Ocean and allows the U.S. military to quickly respond to any conflicts in the nearby region. Jing says if the CCP controls the South China Sea, it would be much harder for the Diego Garcia to get supplies from other bases in East Asia. Not only that, Jing adds that the regime is working to either build or control a string of key maritime choke points. It's known as the string of pearls strategy. In the speech, Jing boasts that if the string of pearls strategy is successful, seizing the Diego Garcia base would be a piece of cake. If that becomes a reality, the U.S. would lose its control over the Indian Ocean and its influence over the Middle East, effectively bringing its position as global leader to an end. He claims using this method allows the Chinese regime to peacefully rob the U.S.'s seat, even without a fight. As a final note in his speech, Jing noted that the strategies he touched on are secret tricks and instructed the audience to keep the information to themselves. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.